So, the carnivore diet. Is the carnivore diet good if you want to build muscle? Is it a good diet to support muscular hypertrophy? Well, the answer is no. It's not a good diet. It's not a diet made to stimulate hypertrophy or to potentiate hypertrophy to its max capacity. And the reason why, it's because it lacks one of the nutrients that stimulate hypertrophy the most, which are carbohydrates, specifically glucose. So, looking at the carnivore diet, it's basically meats and fats from animal sources, which at the base level is a very healthy diet. So, if you're just eating meats and fats from animal sources, then you're having the best sources of protein combined with the best sources of fats. But we do have a problem, which is the availability of glucose or the lack thereof. So you're not really eating carbohydrates at all, so there's no glucose, and that creates a problem. And that problem is twofold. The first problem is looking at glucose as an energy source for your workouts. And that's what we are going to focus on in this video. So, glucose plays a major role in the bioenergetics of your workout. When you work out, you are using glucose. The primary fuel source for your workout is actually glucose. So, when you are doing your classic 3 sets of 10 repetitions, you are tapping into glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose, and using that through glycolysis to produce ATP, to produce energy. And there's a good reason why your body chooses glucose as his main source of energy, because glycolysis is the most potent, is the most powerful bioenergetic pathway. That means that is the pathway that creates energy. Bioenergetics deals with the energetics of biology, so the bioenergetic pathway is simply just a pathway that creates energy, like glycolysis or the beta oxidative pathway, and so on and so forth. But glycolysis, of all the bioenergetic pathways, glycolysis is the most powerful one. Why? Well, power is a function of work over time. So, the more work you can do within a given time unit or a time frame, the more powerful you are. In this case, glycolysis is the most powerful bioenergetic pathway because it's 100 times faster at producing ATP than oxygen phosphorylation. So oxygen phosphorylation is an aerobic style of producing ATP. Glycolysis through production of lactate is the anaerobic pathway, the pathway that does not need oxygen for the muscle fibers to actually produce ATP and energy. So that's the first problem of the carnivore diet, is that when you're working out to build muscle, you actually need glucose in the form of glycogen. And if you're not eating any carbohydrates and not eating any glucose, you will lack the presence of said nutrient. The second thing is that the byproducts of the bioenergetic pathway, that is glycolysis through lactate, actually produces lactate. And lactate actually has a role in hypertrophy. It actually signals and triggers muscle building. So lactate has been found to actually stimulate MyoD, which is one of the myogenic regulatory factors. So it's actually important that you use glycolysis through the anaerobic pathway to produce lactate, because that lactate actually helps to stimulate and upregulate the signal of hypertrophy and helps you to build muscle. Another thing that happens is that you actually create a lot of reactive oxygen species when you're in this mode of lack of oxygen. We call this ischemia. When you're undergoing ischemia within your workout, usually whenever you start to do your reps, let's say you are doing 10 rep max, you are trying to hit failure by the 10th repetition. Let's say you are training like that, that's your style of workout, 3 sets of 10. Well, the more reps you do 1 rep, 2, 3, 4, and so on. The more reps you're doing, the more you are entering ischemia. Contracting muscles will start to constrict blood vessels and capillaries, and there will be less blood reaching the muscle fibers. Oxygen levels go down in the muscle fiber, and you are even more dependent on the anaerobic pathways. So you are even more dependent on the lactate formation through the glycolysis pathway. But the other thing that it also does, the ischemia, the undergoing ischemia within a set, is that it actually starts to create even more reactive oxygen species. You are always creating reactive oxygen species when you're working out, but the more or the less oxygen there is available, the more reactive oxygen species get created, primarily through an enzyme called the xanthine oxidase, which produces a lot of superoxide anion and hydrogen peroxide. And for example, hydrogen peroxide actually signals through the mTOR pathway to upregulate protein synthesis and protein synthesis efficiency. So it's not only that you need glucose to work out, but the byproducts of your style of working out through the anaerobic pathways. Sorry, that's kind of hard to say. Anaerobic pathways, I guess. That style of workout and going into ischemia actually helps to trigger hypertrophy. And lastly, the lack of carbohydrates in the diet and the lack of glucose actually create a problem within the concentration of glycogen. So every time you work out, you deplete some glycogen. Usually you deplete around 30 to 40% of glycogen stores every time you work out. And you eat carbohydrates, and specifically glucose, to rebuild that glycogen. So in a normal diet, every time you eat carbohydrates post-workout, those carbohydrates will serve to rebuild glycogen stores. Well, in the carnivore diet, you don't have carbohydrates. So that constitutes a problem. If you don't have carbohydrates, you will not get to replete glycogen stores. And as you work out, those glycogen stores will deplete more and more and more, into a point where performance will be hampered, will be severely compromised, and you will start to feel like shit in your workouts. You will not get a pump, and performance will be severely compromised. The problem with this is even greater when we see studies that people who train in low glycogen states go even more catabolic. So what does this mean? Well, every time you work out, you actually go catabolic. It's inevitable. When you are working out, you are in a catabolic state. The problem is, the less glycogen you have, the more the muscle fibers rely on amino acids to use as fuel. So the less glycogen you have, the less substrate you have for a reaction, the more it's going to resist the flow from substrate into the reaction and to the product. So the less glycogen you have, the more resistance you are going to have from that glycogen to be actually used as fuel. And the more resistance you have, the more the muscle fibers will have to undergo catabolic, I shouldn't say pathways, but catabolic mechanics to actually oxidize amino acids and essential amino acids like leucine to rely on as fuel. So you are even creating a bigger dish, if you will, by going even more catabolic due to the absence of glucose and specifically glycogen. Now, this is part 1 of this series of videos on the carnivore diet. Part 1, I focused on the absence of glucose and how that actually creates a problem in the bioenergetics of your workouts, because glucose is the main fuel source of your workouts. And in part 2, I want to talk about glucose as a signaling molecule for hypertrophy. So I will see you there.